So greetings everyone. So welcome to today's presentation on vector-based navigation using grid-like representation in artificial agents. In the first part of the presentation, I'll be covering the introduction, the experiments, and the results. In the next part, the next presenter will be covering the methods elaborately. So what is the problem that the authors tried to address in this paper? So the authors tried to address the problem of navigation uh, because it is challenging for an artificial agent to reach the proficiency of mammalian spatial behavior. So here the authors have leveraged the computational functions of grid cells to develop a deep reinforcement learning agent with mammal-like navigation abilities. So in order to understand the problem, we need to understand few concepts. Uh, let's first start with the concept of grid cells. So what are grid cells? So when the rodent explores around, let's think of a mice exploring the environment searching for food or provisions. Each individual cell fires a whole array of different locations across the environment. So here, producing a triangular grid-like firing pattern across the environment. So each cell grid pattern is shifted relative to other cell. So together, the rodent can put a virtual grid of firing patterns across the environment. Here, when the rodent is moving around and exploring the environment, the electrical activity can pass from one cell to the next cell to keep track of where it is currently now at the environment. So here, the authors mainly focused on two core components of navigation. The first one is the ability to self-localize, and the second one is to update its position based on the self-motion. So here, a deep neural network was trained to path integrate within a square arena. So they simulated the trajectories modeled on the rodent foraging behavior, as I've said earlier, focusing on the behavior when a rat or mice is searching the environment for food or any kind of provisions. So now I'll talk about the concept of place cells briefly. So if we consider recording from a single neuron from hippocampus of a rodent, when the rodent foraged the environment looking for food, the neurons know when rodent has visited to one particular place in the environment. So in that case, the neuron fires and signals to the rest of the brain by sending electrical spikes. We can show this firing rate as a function of animals' locations. So different neurons fire at different time as animals explore different part of the environment. Together, this forms a map for the rest of the brain. The network receives transitional and angular velocity signals, and it updates its estimate of location and head direction using those signals. So let's look at the schematic of the network architecture. If you look at the schematic, we can see here that the inputs are the velocities to the first LSTM architecture, and this architecture was trained using backpropagation through time. So this LSTM architecture facilitated the network to combine the current input signals with the activity patterns from the past events. So here you can see the LSTM was mapped to the place cells and the head direction cells via a linear layer. So here the place and head direction activity is defined as a linear function of the input. So there is particularly a regularization technique was applied to this linear layer. So dropout technique was used here, which randomly silenced 50% of the units at each time step. So you can see the place cell from the place cell and the head direction cells, the vector of activities in the place cell and head direction units corresponding to the current position was provided a supervised training signal at each time step. We can find out this type of supervision in mammals. The place and head direction for the place and head direction cell representations, usually that emerge in the rodent pups before appearance of the mature grid cells. In adult rodents, these internal grid cells contribute to the neural activity of place cells. So after training, the network was able to path integrate accurately in this setting and even demonstrated the foraging behavior that typically the rodents show when they're exploring the environment for foods. So one of the interesting observations from the authors of this paper are that the individual units within the linear layer that developed a stable spatial activity profiles which are similar to neurons within the internal network. So if we look at the figures from the results section, we can see from the figure that linear layer units exhibit spatially tuned responses resembling grid cells, border cells, and head direction cells. Here, new terminology comes, which is the border cells. So what are the border cells? The border cells usually shows us the boundary of the environment that are important for navigation. For instance, we can think of a border cell which actually fires when there is a wall close by to the south. So this helps us or the rodents with sensing the boundaries in extended buildings or extended arenas. Here we can see there are three types of plots. The first one is a rate map, which is a rate map of activity over locations. In the second figure, we can see there is a spatial autocorrelogram of the rate maps over activity of locations. And finally, we have a polar plot which shows the activity versus head directions. So here, 25.2% linear layer units, that means to be precise, 129 out of 512 units resemble the grid cells. So if we look at some of the other figures from the result, we can see here that there are two lines here. One is in deep blue and the other one is light blue. Here the dark blue line is actually the self location, which is decoded from the place cells. And we can see the line in light blue that resembles the actual path. And if we look at the figure at the right, we can see the decoded locations before and after training. And we can see it has significantly improved after training. So one of the other interesting observations from the author was that the scale of the grid patterns that are measured from the spatial autocorrelograms of the activity maps, they varied between the units. And it formed a multimodal distribution that are similar to the empirical results achieved from the rodent grid cells. So in order to assess these clusters, the authors they fit mixtures of Gaussians and they tried to find out the most parsimonious number by minimizing the Bayesian information criteria. So what is Bayesian information criteria? That actually helps us strike a balance between the models that are more complex and the models that are good in fitting on the data. So our initial target is to minimize the BIC, the smaller the better. So by minimizing the BIC, the distribution was better fit by 3 Gaussians. So if you look at the figure, the Gaussians had mean of 47 centimeter, 70 centimeter, and 106 centimeter. So we can see from the mean of the first two picks that indicates the presence of scale clusters with a ratio between neighboring clusters of approximately 1.5. And with the second and the third pick, if you consider the means, we can see a ratio of 1.5 between the neighboring clusters. So actually it matches the theoretical predictions and also lies within the ranges reported for the rodents. To ascertain how robust these representations were, the network was retrained for 100 times. And it resulted in similar proportions of grid-like units and other spatially modulated units. And within the units with significant gridness scores, they demonstrated a mean of 23% with a standard deviation of 2.8%. And however, the grid-like representations did not emerge in networks without the regularization. Here, as I've mentioned earlier, a specific regularization technique called dropout was used to silence 50% of the units. So this technique is often used in machine learning to avoid the problem of overfitting. So the previous approaches use pre-configured grid cells. Usually the previous approaches they used hardwired or those grid cells were derived through eigen decomposition of place fields. But here the results and the findings are accord with the perspective that grid cells represent an efficient and robust basis for location code. And the authors proposed a hypothesis that emergent representations provide an effective basis for goal-directed navigation in novel, challenging, and changeable environments. So, in order to prove that hypothesis, multiple experiments are done in this paper. Uh, Internal grid cells facilitate the calculation of goal-directed vectors by providing a Euclidean spatial matrix. The, the vector-based navigation enables the animals to follow a direct route to the remembered goal. It usually decomposes the spatial location encoded by the firing of the grid cells into multi-scale periodic code. So we can estimate the relative position of 2 points by calculating difference in the code at level of each scale. If you look at the figure below, here you can see that we have the goal grid code here, and we have the current grid code here. So we can estimate the relative position of those 2 points by calculating the difference in the code. You can see here the difference is shown using the dotted line. In this experiment, an agent was developed for vector-based navigation. So the grid network is implemented into a larger architecture, and here it used deep reinforcement learning to train the network. The grid network was trained in a supervised fashion like the first experiment with the grid network. Now the velocity signals were perturbed with random noise and visual inputs to better represent information available to the navigating mammals. So it tried to approximate the information available to the navigating mammals. As we know that the firing pattern of the internal grid cell is thought to provide an intrinsic metric for space. But a strong experience-dependent environmental influence can impact that. The spatial scales of grid vary parametrically with change to the familiar environment size and shape. This influence can be possibly mediated by feedback from the place cells, because the place cells have unitary firing locations which facilitate association to location-specific informations. The place cell input to grid cells corrects for drift and anchor grids by mediating the environmental influence. So here, if we look at the figure of the architecture, we can see here a vision module comprised of a CNN architecture was used here. It processed the visual input to provide place and head direction cell activity patterns. This was provided as input to the grid network 5% of the time. So this was done to make it similar to the moving animal making occasional observations of important environmental cues. The output of the linear layer of the grid network represents the agent's current locations. So this was provided as input to a policy LSTM. So the policy LSTM is a second RNN structure here that outputs a value function and control agent's actions. And if the agent reaches a goal, then the goal grid code activity in linear layer was fed as additional input to the policy LSTM. And we can see, like the first experiment, here we have the place cell prediction and the head direction predictions. The initial experiment was performed in simple setting to examine the navigational capacities of the agent. It was inspired by the classic Morris water maze. Here a 2.5 meter by 2.5 meter square arena was considered, and if we look at the figure below, we can see the overhead view at figure B and the agent view at figure C. At figure B, this icon indicates the agent and also indicate the facing direction of the agent. And in the next figure, it shows the agent view of the environment. Here, environment refers to the typical environment. In this experiment, agent was able to self-localize accurately in more challenging setting. This setting is more challenging comparing to the first experiment because here velocity input was noisy and ground truth information about location was not provided like the first experiment. So the agent demonstrated proficient goal finding abilities. It typically takes routes directly to the goal from random starting locations. If we look at the figure below, we can see that in this figure, the dotted lines indicates the first trajectory. On the first trial of the episode, the agent explores. This was the first trial of the episode. Here the agent explores to find the goal. And subsequently, on the after episodes, the agent navigates directly to it. And here we can also see from the figure that the agent was initiated from random starting positions and it was able to navigate directly to the goal on the subsequent trajectories. So here there is also a comparative analysis where the grid cell agent, it basically outperformed the control place agents. If you look at the figure, we can see that the grid cell agent is outperforming the place cell agent. And so the reason could be the grid cell agents enable computation of goal-directed vectors across large-scale spaces. But on the other hand, the place cell agents are inherently limited in terms of navigational range and do not support route planning across unexplored spaces. Here, if we look at the y-axis, we can see that indicates the cumulative reward. And here it shows the reward obtained within a single episode. And here the agent was rewarded 10 points for per goal arrival. And like the first experiment with the grid network, here the linear units resemble spatial representations including grid-like units. So it is similar to the dependencies of mammalian grid cells on self-motion information and spatial cues. So one of the central claims of this paper was that the grid cells endow the agents with ability to perform vector-based navigation. So it enabled the downstream regions to calculate the goal-directed vectors by comparing the current activity with that of a remembered goal. Here, the policy LSTM carries out the similar calculation steps. If you look at the figure on the right, it will see that the policy LSTM receives the current activity patterns, also termed as current grid code. And if we also look at the figure, we can see that it also receives goal grid code, which represent the last time the agent reached the goal. So multiple evidences were presented in this paper in support of vector-based navigation by performing several manipulations. And in the upcoming slide, we will look at this different manipulations or tests that was performed to prove the hypothesis or to provide the evidences. So now, if we look at the first test, to assess whether the goal grid code provided sufficient information to enable the agent to navigate to an arbitrary location. So the original goal code was substituted with a fake goal grid code, which was sampled randomly from location in the environment. Here the agent navigated directly to the newly specified location and circled the absent goals. If we look at the figure on the right, we will see that after successful navigation, the policy LSTM was supplied with a fake goal grid code, so directing the agent to this location where no goal was present. And we can see that the agent followed direct path to this new location and circled the absent goal. So rodents demonstrated similar behavior in probe trials in Morris Water Maze when the escape platform was removed. And in the second test, the grid cell agent was trained without providing goal grid vector to the policy LSTM. So what it actually does is effectively legioning this code. Here the performance of the grid agent drops down to that of a baseline deep reinforcement learning agent. If you look at the figure on the right, we will see that on the y-axis we have the cumulative reward per episodes when no gold code was provided. On this agent on light blue, when no grid code was provided or gold code was provided, the agent's performance dropped down, comparing to the agent when the gold code was provided, which was shown in the deep blue. And you can see that the performance of the baseline agent of a deep reinforcement learning is shown in the deep green color. And this indicates the performance of a A3C, a standard deep reinforcement learning architecture which was trained without any grid or place cell input. So it confirms that the gold grid code is critical for vector-based navigation. And in the third test, the policy LSTM of grid cell agent contained the representation of key components of vector-based navigation. So if you look at the figure, it indicates the decoding accuracy of the place cell agent and the grid cell agent. Here it shows the decoding of goal-directed metric codes. Here by metric codes, this particularly mean the Euclidean distance and the direction, which was derived from the policy LSTM of grid cell and place cell agents. And the bootstrap distribution over 1000 samples of correlation coefficients are each displayed with a violin plot overlaid on a turkey box plot. So for both Euclidean distance and allocentric goal direction were represented more strongly than the place cell agents. If you look at the figure below, we can see the difference between the grid cell agent and the place cell agent. And here it demonstrated a difference of r is equal to 0.17 value for the Euclidean distance. And also for the allocentric goal direction, if we look closely at the figure, we can see there is a difference between the grid cell agent and the place cell agent on the decoding accuracy, which is determined by the Pearson R value. Here it demonstrated a difference of r is equal to 0.22 for allocentric goal difference. So recently our neural representation of goal distance has been reported in mammalian hippocampus. So in the final test was done to determine the specific contribution of grid-like units. Here the authors targeted lesions to goal grid code and re-examined the performance and representations of goal-directed vector. At the first experiment, 25% of most grid-like units were silenced. And at that time, they received or they observed a decoding accuracy of r is equal to 0.38. And performance was worse in that case comparing to lesioning 25% at random. When the lesioning was done randomly, the decoding accuracy was better. It was actually 0.45. So an additional experiment were done where effect of the targeted grid lesions was compared to that of lesioning non-grid units with patchy firing patterns. The targeted grid lesion has greater effect than the patchy non-grid cell lesion. So results supports that the role for grid-like units in vector-based navigation. Having demonstrated the effectiveness of grid-like representations in simple settings, the one that we have seen for the square arena experiment, then the agent's performance was assessed in two more challenging procedurally generated multi-room environments. Those two environments are referred to as goal-driven and goal-doors environment. Notably, these environments are challenging for the deep reinforcement learning agents with external memory. If we look at the figure on the right, we can see that the deep reinforcement learning agents NavMemNet and DNC was performing worse comparing to our grid cell agents. Here we can see the performance of the NavMemNet agent and the DNC agents against the grid cell agents. Here at first, the dark blue in all the figures represents the performance of the grid cell agent. And the one in the purple in both the figure represent the DNC agent. And the light blue represents the NavMemNet agents, which is an agent with an external memory. And the grid cell agents exhibited high level of performance. it was strikingly robust across a change of network hyperparameters. So it shows that for a specific range of hyperparameters, they were strikingly robust all throughout the way. So in order to visualize this, we need to see the AVC performance curve for all the agents. Here the AVC performance gives robustness to the hyperparameters like learning rates, baseline costs, entropy costs, and seeds, etc. For each environment, 60 agent replicas were run, and the light purple curve here represents the grid cell agent, and here the blue curve represents the place cell agent in 3 of the figures. And the one in the bottom, which is shown in dark purple, represents the A3C agent. In all the cases, the grid cell agent shows higher robustness to various and the variations in hyperparameters and seeds. And here we can see that the agent was able to navigate to the goal or to reach the goal more frequently than the control agents or human experts. And the human experts are thought of a typical benchmark for the performance of deep reinforcement learning agents in game playing scenarios. And here the agents were tested without retraining in a considerably larger environment than the environments that they have seen previously. The grid cell agent was able to generalize to the larger environment effectively without being explicitly retrained. Although the environment was much more complex here, the agent was able to decode the key metric codes from the grid agent policy LSTM with higher accuracy during the initial period of the navigation. The substantially higher decoding accuracy achieved for the grid cell agent than the place cell agent and the deep reinforcement learning agents, what we will see in the later figures. But for now, let's focus on the figures on the right. Here, in this figure, we can see the distribution of the test performance over 100 episodes. And showing the ability of the agents to generalize to a larger version of the Goldor environment. Here you can see that the grid cell agent outperformed the place cell and the A3C agent. And on the figure on the right, we can see a heat map. Here the value function of the grid cell agent is shown or projected into an example on a larger Goldor environment. And here it is projected as a heat map. Here the red color represents the higher value function. And we can see that the dotted line here show the extent, the dotted line here show the extent of the original environment. We can see that the grid cell agent for a considerably larger environment, it was able to approximate the Euclidean distance using a higher value function. And now in this figure, we can see that the grid cell agent outperformed the place cell agent and the deep reinforcement learning control agents on the figure on the right. Now, a core feature of mammalian spatial behavior is ability to exploit the novel shortcuts and traverse the unvisited portions of the space. So this capacity is based on the vector-based navigation. So this is one of the bases of vector-based navigation. The grid cell agent robustly demonstrated these abilities, but the comparison agent was not able to do so. And the grid cell agent was able to demonstrate these abilities in a specially designed neuroscience inspired mazes. So the agent was able to take direct routes to the goal as soon as they become available. So if we look at the two figures, we can see that in the figure A, the example trajectory in the linear submerged maze is presented here. Here the door 5 is explicitly kept open. So the grid cell agent starts from the initial location and it visits all the way to the goal. And if we look at the next figure, which is figure B, we can see the testing configuration. By the way, the figure A represents the training configuration, and here figure B represents the testing configuration. And in the testing configuration, all the doors were kept open. And here, the grid cell agent uses the newly available shortcuts. If you look at here, it goes all the way throughout the shortest route to the goal. And if you look at the histogram here, it shows the agent's strong preference for the direct routes. We can see that the agent has a strong preference for the most direct routes. Here we can see the preference for route A over route 2, route 1 over route 2. And now in the figures below and figure D, we can see this is the example trajectory during training in a double E-maze environment. In this double E-maze environment, the corridor 1 door is closed for the first setting. Here both of the corridor 1 doors were closed, you can see here. And after that, during the testing configuration, both of the doors were kept open. And the corridor 1 was kept open, and 100 grid agent trajectories was performed. And the agent prefers the newly available shortcuts. That's what we can see in the histogram here. And there are conventional simultaneous localization and mapping methods, but they need accurate and complete map, where the nature and the position of the goal is externally defined. However, the proposed deep reinforcement learning agent was able to learn the complex control policies end-to-end from a sparse reward. And it can automatically take direct routes involving shortcuts to the defined goal. And these abilities outperform the previous deep reinforcement learning approaches. The contributions of these papers are: the grid-like representations provide an effective basis for flexible navigation in challenging novel environments. Here, the authors initially started with a simple setting and then moved on to the multi-compartment settings. It supports the theoretical models of grid cells and vector-based navigation that were previously lacking empirical support. And the paper has also demonstrated that vector-based navigation can be combined with a path-based barrier avoidance strategy to enable the exploitation of optimal routes in challenging multi-room environments. Finally, it furnished the agents with Euclidean geometric framework, which is similar to their proposed computational role in the mammals. And now I will move on to the critics and discussion part. So firstly, directly drawing the concrete conclusions from relative performance of human and agent is necessarily difficult, though providing human-level performance is useful for broad comparison and represents the commonly used benchmark. Here, the human expert receives only 10 episodes worth of training in each environment before undergoing 20 episodes of testing. So considerably less training was received than experienced by the network. One of the reasons could be human mammalian brain has evolved to path integrate, and naturally human experts had a lifelong worth of relevant navigational experience. The second critic would be they could show the combination of such navigational strategies with more memory intensive approaches. Here, one of the memory intensive agent that was used, like the NavMemNet agent, were trained purely using reinforcement learning, so did not utilize the supervised learning implemented by the grid cell agent. So the problems of goal-driven and the goal doors environment were not readily solved by the use of external memory alone. The final question is, how biologically plausible is it to implement backpropagation through time in the brain? Because it requires access to the information that is non-local to the synapse. So we need information about errors many layers downstream. So that has long been thought to be biologically implausible. But recent research provides new insights into how a process similar to backprop may be implemented in the brain. So I think this is a potentially promising avenue to explore.